Hey there, nation, and welcome to the show where we help you to play miniatures wargaming on a budget. It is I, Commander Cheapskate, and we're back with an episode of Cheap Shots, the series dedicated to many saving tips and helping you to save as much money as possible on this wonderful hobby. And on today's episode, we're going to show you guys how to quickly and more importantly cheaply paint up Warhammer Underworld's Hexbane Hunters. Hexbane's Hunters is a beautiful warband of really beautifully sculpted witch hunters that you could use in your games of Warhammer Underworlds, or in my situation for my gaming channel and gaming needs, I'm using these guys as witch hunters for an upcoming Mordheim campaign. And as you can see here, this is the beautiful tabletop standard that we have, and by following the tips, techniques, as well as materials that we suggest with our Cheapskate method, you can actually paint up this entire warband for a grand total of $30.97. And that, of course, is assuming that you're purchasing everything for the very first time. When you compare that from the same materials that you purchase from Games Workshop Citadel as well as Army Painter, you're talking about a grand total savings of $172.73. So come with us today as we go ahead and talk about exactly how we paint up this warband step by step using the cheapest materials possible to get a really beautiful tabletop result. So let's get this video on a roll. So the first thing we're going to do, of course, is to assemble, prime, and to base coat the miniatures as well. And as you can see in this photo, the actual assemblies for these miniatures is actually quite simple, and the reason why is because they are all push-fit assembly. That's one of the nice things about the Warhammer Underworlds miniature line. Now, once you get it all push-fit, what you need to do then, of course, is to prime your miniatures as well. In this situation, I decided to use flat white Rust-Oleum primer. I can get this stuff at my local Walmart for $3.99. If I wanted to use the Citadel method, I would have to use a can of Corax white spray, which costs $17, so almost 5 times more than what I'd actually pay for the white primer that I use from Walmart. Now, priming does a couple of things. The first thing it does, it actually gives a textured surface for your acrylic paints to adhere to when you apply it onto your miniature. If you were actually to take acrylic paints and apply it directly onto the bare plastic without any primer, any sort of friction would actually cause the paint to rub off the miniature and actually ruin the overall finish of your miniature. So using primer is really helpful for that. Another thing that primer also does, it also has a large impact on the vibrancy of the colors that you have in terms of its value. Traditionally speaking, if you want to go with a more brighter color or vibrant paint scheme, you traditionally go with a white primer, whereas if you're going for more of subdued or more of a darker tone, you'd go with a black primer, and for a neutral one, you just go with gray. Now, because I'm doing a quick paint method with these miniatures, meaning that I'm going to use an oil wash to wash these miniatures, it's going to darken down the value of the colors quite significantly. So if you'll notice, the colors I use in this one will be quite vibrant, and that is also the reason why I use a white primer on this. Now, once you guys get done spray painting your miniatures with your primer, what you'll need to do, of course, is apply a base coat for all the flesh on these miniatures. Now, luckily for us, there's not very much flesh exposed on these guys. For the most part, it's just their faces, their heads, as well as maybe their hands if they're not wearing gloves. So in this situation, for Amos Duncaro as well as for Bridget, I decided to use apple barrel flesh. This stuff costs 50 cents at my local Walmart for a 2-ounce tube. You could, of course, use Cadian flesh tone from Citadel, but that's about 10 times as much at $4.55. For Hexbane himself, as well as for Silent Pock, I decided to use Burnt Umber as well as Nutmeg Brown. Those are from Apple Barrel as well. Both cost 50 cents on my local Walmart. The corresponding colors for that would be Wildwood from Games Workshop, which costs $7.80, and Bugman's Glow, which costs $4.55 as well. Just put 2 thin coats of your base coat directly onto the flesh, and then we're ready to move on for our dry brushes. Now, unfortunately, when I actually started painting this warband, I got a little over anxious and I actually started painting and dry brushing before I took photos of every single step. So I do apologize for that. I'm not a professional painter by any means, or even a professional YouTube video creator. So I do apologize for that part. The part I'm referring to, of course, are the 2 dogs. We have, I believe it's called Rot Spike, and I forgot the name of the other dog, but there are 2 dogs that come with this warband. For one of the dogs, I painted in taupe gray, which you can get at your local Hobby Lobby from Anita's Acrylic. It costs 65 cents. The corresponding color from Games Workshop will be Rakarth Flesh, which costs us $4.55. As for the other dog, I painted in 2 thin coats of Apple Barrel Pavement, which costs 50 cents at my local Walmart. The corresponding color to that from Citadel would be Slanesh Eshin Gray for $4.55. And that's basically what I just did for the fur on that. So now that I got the fur taken care of, what I'm going to do now is dry brush all these miniatures with the base coats that we just applied previously. Now, for the dog that I painted in Pavement, I basically do 2 layers of dry brushing on that particular miniature. I first start off with a dry brush of Pewter Gray by Apple Barrel Paint, which costs 50 cents from your local Walmart. The corresponding color to that from Citadel would be Slanesh Gray, which costs $4.55. And then I do another dry brush using Folk Arts Pale Gray, which costs 75 cents, and the corresponding color from Citadel would be Ulthuan Gray for $4.55. What that does, it creates a beautiful kind of multi-layered highlighting technique that's on the actual dog itself. For the dog that I painted in taupe gray earlier, I will use Ivory by Apple Barrel Paint, which costs 50 cents at my local Walmart. You have to use Longbeard Gray from Games Workshop for $4.55. For Silent Pog, which is the guy I painted with the Nutmeg Brown, I dry brushed him in flesh. For Hexbane himself, the leader of the warband, for his, I used Territorial Beige by Apple Barrel Paint as well, which also costs 50 cents at my local Walmart. The corresponding color from Citadel would be Baylor Brown, which costs $4.55. And then finally for Bridget as well as Amos Duncaro, I used Delta's Serum Coats Peaches and Cream, which costs 65 cents at my local Hobby Lobby. The corresponding color from Citadel would be Flay One Flesh, which costs $4.55 for that. Now, dry brushing is actually kind of an important step, and the reason why is because it creates the illusion of depth in your miniatures. The dry brushing pigment actually catches upon the raised surfaces in your miniature while leaving the darker color in the recesses, which kind of creates this layered sort of three-dimensional effect with depth on the miniatures as well. Now, if you'll do notice, there is a bit of a chalky kind of pastel texture with each of these miniatures after we dry brush them. If that is a concern for yours, do not worry. When we actually get to the oil wash stage, that will actually smooth out those transitions between the dry brushes and the base coats, and it'll all seamlessly flow together. So the next detail we're going to work on real fast is on the actual collars and harnesses that both of these dogs have. For the dog that's done in black, I just basically took out his collar in 2 thin layers of Territorial Beige, and for the cream colored dog, I picked out his collar as well as harness in 2 thin layers of Burnt Umber. Just apply those base coats and ready to move on. So the next detail we're going to focus on for these miniatures, especially for the human fighters, are their trousers. So as you can see in this photo, I used 4 different colors. First of all, for Bridget, I used Folk Arts Skyline, which costs you about 75 cents at your local Hobby Lobby. The corresponding color would be Rust Gray from Citadel, which costs $4.55 for that. For Amos Duncaro, I decided to use Pewter Gray by Apple Barrel, as well as Delta Serum Coats Lotus Blossom for Hexbane himself. You can get that at your local Hobby Lobby for about 65 cents as well. I would suppose that the closest color to that from Games Workshop would be Doomfire Magenta, which costs $7.80 for that color. And then finally, for Silent Pog on the right-hand side, I put 2 thin coats of Moccasin Brown from Anita's Acrylic that costs you 65 cents at your local Hobby Lobby, as opposed to XV88, which is the color you'd use from Citadel in order to paint exactly the same way. The next detail we're going to focus on next is on the jackets that these characters are wearing. For both Hexbane as well as Silent Pog, I picked out their overcoats in 2 thin layers of pigment paint by Apple Barrel. As for Bridget's parade uniform, I picked out 2 thin layers of Anita's True Red, which is made by Anita's Acrylic. You can get this at your local Hobby Lobby for about 65 cents. The corresponding color from Citadel would be Mephiston Red, which runs you $4.55 for that product. And then finally, for Amos Duncaro on the far right-hand side, I used 2 thin layers of Marsh Green by Apple Barrel Paint. I can get this at my local Walmart for 50 cents for that product. And the corresponding color from Games Workshop would be Creed Green, which costs you $7.80 for that one. So with that, we're pretty much done with most of the details on these miniatures. Now it's time for us to start focusing on the finer detail elements with the different colors. First of all, for Bridget, for her hair, I decided to pick that out in 2 thin layers of King's Gold by Apple Barrel's Paint. The corresponding color from that from Citadel would be Averland Sunset, which costs $4.55. I just put 2 thin layers directly onto her very aristocratic style hairstyle, so that way it's kind of contrasts nicely with the red as well as the blue of her trousers. Now, as for Hexbane himself, I actually picked out his hat in 2 thin layers of Pewter Gray. I just wanted his hat just to be a little bit different from his jacket, to kind of give him this kind of faded ramshackle kind of look, like he's kind of putting his clothing together from whatever you can find out in the underworld of the Warhammer universe. And then I start working on the torch that he's actually carrying. What I actually do is I actually paint up the tips of the torches in 2 thin layers of True Red by Anita's Acrylic, and then from there we're ready to move on to our next detail. So for the rest of the actual torch, what I actually do is I actually kind of paint a little bit with using a Ripe Tomato by Apple Barrel Paint. It costs about 50 cents at my local Walmart. The corresponding color would be Troll Slayer, which costs $4.55 from Games Workshop. And I paint that orange about halfway down the length of the actual flames to kind of create this nice transition of colors. And then from what I decided to do then was to dry brush it with Tropic Orange, which was made by Apple Barrel Paint as well. That cost me 50 cents at my local Hobby Lobby. You would have to use, I believe it's called Fire Dragon Bright, which costs $4.55 at your local Games Workshop. And the very last step that I did, of course, is I used King's Gold to paint up the rest of the flames as well by glazing it directly onto the actual flame texturing. What I actually did is I actually watered down the King's Gold with water until almost was about the consistency of milk. And what I did is I decided to paint this directly like a wash over the red as well as oranges of the torches. And what this does, it kind of creates this kind of like yellowish red effect that kind of transfer along the length of the flames. It kind of creates this kind of eerie kind of burning look, which is actually kind of nice. So I was really happy with the way how that turned out with the torch. So the next detail we work on, especially for the human fighters, are all the leather goods these guys are wearing, which is basically coming down to one color, which is paved with apple barrel paint. I put this 2 thin layers directly onto the boots these guys are wearing for the most part, as well as for the gloves of Silent Pock on the right hand side. For Bridget, I actually use that for both not only her boots, but also the harness that she wears around her hips with her holsters, as well as her axe handle and other items along the belt that she's wearing. And afterwards, I then decided to focus next on the kind of other wood elements that they also had, as well as the other leather goods that these guys are carrying as well. For example, for Amos Duncaro, for his pontoons that he's wearing on his boots, as well as for the harness he's wearing for his leather goods on his chest, I picked out 2 thin layers of moccasin brown by Nita's acrylic. Same thing with the axe handles, as well as the pouches on the back of Bridget. I did the same thing with the leather sheaths, as well as the quiver for Silent Pock, as well as for the leather goods on Haskell Hexbane for his gloves, his boots, as well as for his belt, so that way it contrasts nicely with the black overcoat that we put on this character earlier. And once we're done with that, I do an all-over dry brush with pale gray by Folk Art all over the clothing that we painted in the base coats earlier. The reason why I do this is kind of give these guys kind of like a faded, kind of ashy kind of look to them, like these guys have been on the trail for a long time, crawling through the different ruins of the Warhammer Underworlds universe, or in my opinion, going through the depths of Mordheim as well, looking for evildoers as well as treasure in order to loot as well. And now that we're done with that dry brushing, the next thing we gotta do is work on the finer details, and we can really move on to our metallics. So the final details in this part, where we're looking at things like the quivers of the arrows, the actual arrows themselves, the handles of the torches, as well as the handles of the weapons, as well as the spikes that they also have for their wooden stakes that they have scattered throughout their person. Now for that, you basically use a combination of both territorial beige for like things like axe handles, as well as things like the axe hatchet handles that Bridget has, as well as the huge double-handed axe that Amos has. And then as for the crossbow bolts themselves, as well as the wooden stakes, I picked out 2 thin layers of taupe gray by Nita's acrylic, so that way it looks kind of nice contrast as opposed to what the normal other wooden things look like as well. And I also did exactly the same thing with the torch that Haskell Hexbane is also carrying. And with that final last detail completed, we can now start working on the metallic elements. So when it came to the metallic elements, I decided to add some variety of color with the different metallics to kind of make these guys stand out a little bit differently from the rest of their peers. For example, for both Silent Pock as well as for Amos Duncaro, I painted all their armor in 2 thin layers of gunmetal gray by Folk Art. It's a beautiful gunmetal color that costs only 75 cents at your local Walmart. The corresponding color from Citadel would be Lead Belcher, which costs $7.80, which is about 10 times more than the actual gunmetal gray. And the reason why I went this darker kind of gunmetal color is to show that these guys' armor is probably a little bit more crude than the ones that Haskell Hexbane as well as Bridget also wear. At the same time, I also picked out some more additional metallic elements in Folk Art Copper, which also runs you 75 cents at your local Walmart. The corresponding color to that would be Games Workshop's Screaming Bell, which costs $7.80, which is about 10 times as much as the Folk Art product. Now for that, what I decided to do is pick out things like belt buckles, the actual weapon of the crossbow that Silent Pock uses as well, some of the metal tools that hang off the belt of Amos Duncaro. Just put 2 thin layers of those metallic paints and you're ready to move on to the rest of the gang. So for the rest of the warband, like Haskell Hexbane, as well as for Bridget, I picked out their silver elements in 2 thin layers of Anniversary Silver by Folk Art. Cost 75 cents at your local Walmart. The corresponding color would be Ironbreaker, which costs $7.80 from Games Workshop. So for any of the silver elements, like their axe blades, the blades of their weapons, the flintlock mechanics of their guns, as well as the body armor they're wearing, I picked out 2 thin layers of Anniversary Silver to kind of create that little bit of a contrast as opposed to Amos as well as to Silent Pock as well. Other metallic elements I also focused on, of course, was using Folk Art's Copper, but I also used Deco Art's Metallics Emperor's Gold, which is a great substitute for Retributor armor. Deco Art's Emperor's Gold only costs you 75 cents at your local Walmart, while Retributor armor costs $7.80. So things like little joints on the belts that they're wearing, as well little charms that hang off their clothing, as well as the little charm on the brim of Haskell Hexbane's hat, for example. I picked out those elements. At the same time, I also used Aged Copper as well to pick out some things like the flintlock mechanisms of the weapons that both Bridget as well as as Hexbane are using. Things like the buttons along Bridget's coat, for example. Those are things I use for that. I also use Anniversary Steel for little buckles and hooks and loops directly onto the harnesses of the two dogs as well. So now that we're done for most of the detail of the miniatures, the next thing we're going to work on now is on the bases. So these guys automatically come with textured bases, which look absolutely fantastic. In order to create this effect, what I decided to do is paint in 2 thin layers of Tuscan Teal by Apple Barrel Paint. It's a beautiful dark turquoise color that you can get your local Walmart for about 50 cents as well. The corresponding color from this would be from Games Workshop, would be Thunderhawk Blue, which costs us $4.55 on that one. And what I did is I just put 2 thin layers of the Tuscan Teal directly onto the bases. Now granted, a little bit of the white is showing through the actual base coat that I put down for the Tuscan Teal, but that is perfectly fine because when we actually get to our dry brush, it's going to solve all those problems for us. So the color that I use to dry brush the bases, I use Dutch Aqua by Folk Art. It costs 75 cents at my local Hobby Lobby. And if you wanted to use something similar to this, you have to use Athermatic Blue by Citadel, which costs you $7.80, which is about 10 times as much as well. It's a nice pale kind of turquoise color. It does a beautiful job of actually catching all the raised surfaces of the texturing while leaving the darker Tuscan Teal in the recesses as well. At the same time, I also use light mocha as well in order to pick out the bones as well as the skulls that are on the bases as well. And those cost about 50 cents at local Walmart. The corresponding color to that would actually be Xandri Dust by Games Workshop, which costs $4.55 from that. And once we're done with the bases, the next step we need to work on now is an oil wash. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, we are using a quick paint method in order to paint up these miniatures, which means we only use one wash in order to do so, which is an oil wash. Now for most people when they do this step, they like to use Army Painter Strong Tone, which is a wonderful product. It does exactly what it advertised does. It actually washes your miniature, also darkens down the vibrancy, smooths out the coats, and also brings a lot of the details you couldn't see earlier. The only problem though is that Army Painter Strong Tone costs $32 a can, whereas opposed to the product I use, which is Mid-Wax Poly Shade in Mission Oak, that costs $6.99, about 5 times less than the Army Painter Strong Tone. It does exactly the same thing. Now what the oil washing does is a couple of things. The first thing that it does is it seeps into the recesses of the miniatures, bring a lot of those details that we couldn't see earlier. Things like the folds in the fabric, the individual spaces of the blocks and the streets that they're walking on. Same thing with all the rivets as well as sections of the armor plating that they're also wearing as well. Brings out those wonderful details there. A second thing that it also does too is that the oil wash smooths out the transitions that we have between our dry brushing and our base coating, getting rid of that chalky kind of pastel look and actually smoothing out those transitions for us, and does a really beautiful job of doing that. And the last thing that the oil wash also does, it also mutes down the vibrancy of the colors that we use. So as you can see, they're not as bright and vibrant as they used to be. In fact, the volume has been toned down significantly from that oil wash, and that's the reason why I use such bright colors in the first place, so that way it kind of tones it down when we go through the oil wash. Now, of course, you will have to let this stuff dry and cure for about 24 hours. And the reason why you have to let it cure for that is because there is polyurethane in the poly shade, which could create a clear coat, high gloss coating over your miniature. It's going to protect it from fading as well as being damaged as well, which is really nice as well. If you try to handle this stuff before it completely dries, you could ruin the finish by actually tearing off the actual paint job because it gets kind of tacky that way. Now the next 2 steps, of course, is completely optional when you have your matte varnish spray. For me personally, I don't like that high gloss sheen that the poly shade actually has with the polyurethane, so I buy a can of Krylon matte varnish spray from my local Walmart. It costs me $5.99. I just give it the quick once over real quick on the miniatures, and it brings on the sheen of the polyurethane. Now, of course, you could use Minotaurian varnish, which is by Citadel, which costs $19.50 per can, which is about 4 times more than the actual Krylon matte varnish. So I highly recommend staying away from that as well. And the very last thing we do, of course, is to rim the bases. Once again, I use 2 thin coats of Skyline by Folk Art. It's another beautiful grayish blue color, and it actually looks quite nice when in comparison with the bases they're walking on, as well as the overall paint scheme of these characters. And there you have it. This is the end result of using our Cheapskate method in order to create this tabletop look for all of our miniatures. Now, assuming that you're purchasing everything for the very first time from our Cheapskate method, you're talking about a grand total investment of $3.97 to create the exact same effect with your Hexbane hunters as we have as well. So now that we're going to talk about how our Cheapskate method would work, let's go and talk about the materials that you need to buy from both Army Painter as well as Citadel in order to paint up your miniatures exactly the same way we did, but using their products instead. So these are the materials you need to purchase from Games Workshop as well as from Army Painter in order to paint up your miniatures exactly the same way we did. You'll have to buy a can of Corax White Spray, which costs $17, as well as Thunderhawk Blue, Averland Sunset, Longbeard Gray, Caliban Green, Luganeth Orange, all those costing you $4.55. Also buy a pot of Wildwood, which is going to cost you $7.80, as well as Bugman's Glow, Cadian Flesh Tone, Baylor Brown, Slanesh Gray, Eshin Gray, as well as Flayed One Flesh, and all those cost you $4.55 for those. You also need to buy a pot of Doomfire Magenta, which costs you $7.80 for that, as well as the colors Mephiston Red, XV88, Rakarth Flesh, all those costing you $4.55. Now for some of your metallic paints, you're going to use Brass Scorpion, Lead Belcher, as well as Screaming Bell and Ironbreaker. Each one of those costing you $7.80 for those, as well as Rust Gray and Ulthuan Gray for your grays, which costs you $4.55. You also need to buy Aethermatic Blue for the turquoise, which is going to cost you $7.80 for that, as well as Retributor Armor for all the gold pieces, which costs you another $7.80 on top of that. Now to do the quick paint method, you'll need to buy a can of Army Painter Strong Tone, which is going to cost you $32 for that, as well as a can of Munitarian Varnish if you want to do the matte varnish, which is going to cost you $19.50. So assuming that you're purchasing all these items for the very first time in order to paint up your warband, you're talking about a grand total investment of $203.70 to paint your miniatures exactly the same way we did, only using the Citadel method instead. Now when you subtract the Cheapskate method, which is only the $30.97, you know, the grand total savings of $172.73 being saved. So there you guys have it. That's how you guys can quickly and more importantly cheaply paint up Hexbane's hunters for Warhammer Underworld, or for as witch hunters in your future games of Mordheim as well. That's good to listen to you guys. As always, please feel free to like, comment, and or subscribe. Your guys' input is valuable to us as always. Also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, as well as blog.com for all these greatest hobby news related to this channel. That's good for this one, you guys. We'll catch you guys next one. Peace out and stay classy.